Welcome everyone to YouTube Masterclass. This is a COURSERA run program, so if you want credit for it, contact COURSERA. They'll get you all the tips and tricks you need and the paperwork, and you can talk to them about the financial measure of this class for taking credit at Harvard, USC, CALARTS, because we're using that triumvirate to kickstart a program at Harvard, CalArts and USC are putting in their best foot forward to see that some kind of an industry-based class at Harvard come about. That no one's doing that class but me. I'm not sure. It seems like there's several people that have been involved with that. Hundreds of professors have been involved with that project before, so I'm not taking the position lightly. I'm just saying that hundreds of professors have come together and tried to build a Harvard Film School, even from their own whereabouts, is only possible because of the remote being legitimized, especially now that not all of us can always get to class. And that's why I'm producing this from Colorado, and that it's a Harvard especially class, but that USC and CalArts are my picks for my favorite film schools, because CalArts so unpredictable and USC so creative that you then have Harvard, this great school with all the best programs that there are, now merging this film school because we can use it like a public school coming from these private institutions. Setting up a public school version of the program is only to set up an independent film program at Harvard, so this can actually count as we construct the making of a film school at Harvard. It sounds like one of those interesting, like it came from last year, or I Know What You Did Last Summer, or it came from outer space. Now we're going to look at this, and this is the first film we're looking at, and this is a film criticism class. Criticism is writing about art, writing about aesthetics, writing about the politics of aesthetics, the psychology of aesthetics. Criticism is what we do when we're writing about art, because the only type of aesthetic writing you can do about art is technically criticism. That a lot of these points should have been made at the early on of this class, I apologize. It was also in some kind of shifty time mic that we're just going to leave alone with and see adjusted with as necessary. That we do want you to get 16 hours of class. 16 hours of class for 4 units of the class is how we're judging it. Whether you can take 8 and get 2 units is up to COURSERA, but that they want us to actually see all the classes and then take the final, which guess what? There's 3 more classes in this semester, and then we have to wait till summer in May to have another class. So what are we going to do? We're going to cry, and hope that the film class comes back right. All 5 of you that are teaching this class, I know you're my loyal apostles, but there's no point, because right now, in such an era that film is getting back on its knees and back into the open, none of us really here are trying to brag so much at all that we're trying to grandstand and say notice me, because right now everybody's down. So don't just wave a flag at yourself or me or anybody and say that we're trying to grab attention, because we're just trying to help the film medium continue on successfully, whether we're in it for ourselves or not. We're trying to help the continuation of the film arts and medium be expressed. And you know that's hard on professors, whether they make films or not. The whole film industry has gone out of business, and you want them to come back in, and you want to do your part to share with them. And that's where some of the proceeds of this class, other than what goes to the producers, has gone, is to see where the preservation of the art of medium, because if you preserve it, then it lasts even in the periods that it's fallen down. And so I'll take credit for the speech, but not for the awareness, that we're trying to promote film awareness and get people to buy these products, and not like a self-promotion. Like we know some of these schools are the best at putting these students out, but we are also humbled to say we love the film industry more than we love anything else. So please come back. It's not like otherwise you're left in the hand of us effing it up out here. Come on, man. Anyway, like Yellow Submarine, not an effed up film. Actually, Leonard Maltin gives this film 4 stars. He's He's the greatest of critics. He's seen 50,000 films. He knows a good film from a bad one. And I don't say anything bad about films, but the point is that like Yellow Submarine gets 4 stars. That's the ultimate grade you can get, an A+ for a movie that it's animation. And he started his career in the animation field, writing of Mice and Magic, about Disney cartoons and Mickey Mouse cartoons and the origin of Mickey Mouse cartoons. And it's a fascinating book. But the Yellow Submarine has one of those things that all these animated movies don't have, and that is the certain tie-in with a rock band, for one thing. I mean, we do have other rock bands that are going to make cartoon shows, but a cartoon came along out of the Beatles' later period, which is after they'd already written the song Yellow Submarine for the album Revolver that it was on, although I've heard that Rubber Soul might have had an early copy of Yellow Submarine attached to it, that the American release and the British release are different, but the British release of the Beatles has Yellow Submarine first coming on Revolver. And then it was such an interesting song to later go back to. It was not a story I'm familiar with, other than it seemed like a psychedelic cartoon in the makings, and that someone had approached them with a psychedelic cartoon in the makings goes to show that this is one of the Beatles' 5 most important movies. You've got Hard Day's Night, Help, Yellow Submarine, Magical Mystery Tour, and we'll go over some of those later, but there's also Let It Be. And I've seen Let It Be in piecemeal, but that I've heard the whole soundtrack of Let It Be is true. And because there's another soundtrack that you can get of Let It Be that's really hard to track down, and I had it in my possession. My father has it in his possession. And it's a really beautiful, beautiful Let It Be version, and that it's different than the movie. But the movie itself, I've seen in parts. I've heard stories, about the whole thing about George Harrison being in prison on both of those albums because of some pot he bought from Ravi Shankar and other urban legends. And I don't get into all that, but the Yellow Submarine comes in a pivotal Beatles moment, that the Beatlemania had stretched through to the point that they'd been in every kind of genre there was supposedly through those other films, that they'd either made parodies of those films or that they had gone to the length of their own compadres in British humor to combine them with American humor, that we'd see would be the beginnings of the Monty Python Flying Circus trail years later, and that we see these cartoons in the Beatles' influence, Terry Gilliam, of the Monty Python cartoons only a few years later when they started, and that these cartoons were from a studio that was in Britain that was making cartoons that also remind me of Terry Gilliam's cartoons. That the Yellow Submarine goes back to an animation tradition as old as Lottie Reiniger, and that it's a feature film, her having made Adventures of Prince Ahmad, that it's a fantasy film, that the Beatles are lost in time, and that they ride around in a yellow submarine. Which always made me wonder, and the question was asking, did the Beatles know what the words Yellow Submarine meant, or what anybody else took it for? Because they seem to have a bunch of double entendres. And were the Beatles really thinking about making a cartoon out of it when Revolver was released? Because it could have been that early. Projects do come along and stop and start and jump in beginning. But then if they would have released it right after Revolver, would they have called it Yellow Submarine, risking that was on another album and they still had the commercial merit to go on? All of these unanswered. But it doesn't really matter, because the Yellow Submarine was its own CD release, which negates all and says that they had a CD release out of it that was the soundtrack, and over half of it's George Martin's classical type music. And then if George Martin composed a score for it, the Beatles came back with 5 tracks, and the first one was the Yellow Submarine track. So again, if the CD had come before that was Revolver, would it have been the Yellow Submarine track that had been first? Would they have been too blatant, like we're coming off of this album? Was it planned? Usually in Beatle history, though, something is planned, and then if there's even a mistake and something slipping through the cracks, they'll grab the next plan. And that isn't to say it's a plan B or anything. It's just that they had so many things lined up with their career that they had to do it all, and to do it all, they had to make a cartoon. And they have songs like Hey Bullfrog and Only a Northern Song and All Together Now. And that Yellow Submarine has a sing-along moment with All Together Now is excellent. That those songs are up to par with all the other Beatles songs, and to own the entire canon or oeuvre of the Beatles music, you have to have the Yellow Submarine soundtrack, which I do have, and we won't take a jump back there at the nightstand to see if I can get it. But the movie is interesting because there's this copy version of these things called the Blue Meanies that keep showing up in Beatles lore after that. Some say it's even seen on the Sgt. Pepper soundtrack. That doesn't scare you. There's a Blue Meanie on there. I don't know. I'm not going to look because I'm too scared. That the Beatles were this ragingly huge band commercially, but that right then the pop music of the day was actually this art rock, and that pop had become art was such a stressor of Andy Warhol and other avant-garde filmmakers like Kenneth Anger that were making these films. And we're seeing from even these British mainstream studios that made Yellow Submarine that there was an experiment in animation entirely that they could use to reflect their own type of views, and that these set up the avant-garde film is only coming from pop art because the commercial industry at this time in the 60s has gone to the artistic high line and become sort of a medium of artists in the modern era of cinema. And that this medium of artists, now we've got a famous band who's using good vibes to fight off these Blue Meanies, and the Blue Meanies now are starting to sound like something we're not, but that there really could be the battle of the mind in a psychedelic state, or it could be getting you ready for things that you have to fight psychologically in life. And that is kind of these infrastructure, these ubiquitous Blue Meanies that seem to be created just by a bad mood. And then a bad mood has for some psychedelic trippers said that there was a Blue Meanie in front of them, and that can happen in your psychological experience too. And these guys are saying, well, we know it's kind of like for kids, but we're still trying to cheer you up. You know what I mean? Me doing a British accent could be kind of offensive because a British person could take offense by that, even with the voices of this film being British. Not that I'm saying that I'm ever rousing up any consciousness desire to offend anyone in Great Britain with an accent. And neither would I admit that a British person wouldn't be able to do a better version of that, of me saying it. But we're not making fun. We're being silly. And being silly is okay, but if it sounds like the British accent you're hearing is from someone that sounds like they're deriding them, that's when we remember the old-fashioned way not to use an F word in a show like this, or in a movie, or just in life. Is if it's a mean thing that you're saying it, don't say it. If you're like, this is the effing movie you've got to see, that's okay. But if you're like, you are lesser than me because you're effing dumb, don't use it, because that's where you're hinging on the line of censorship, saying, well, now you're being cruel to someone else and targeting someone else, and you shouldn't do that. And then here's why I'm talking about it, because these movies never have to worry about censorship, and they deal with some of the darkest subject matter there is. And that there's so much light and love in this film doesn't mean that every moment it isn't trying to be swallowed, and that they're actually not showing a reflection of the animation industry in the sense that it's overbearing upon you, that these were all very grateful animators and making grateful things is why the Beatles do overcome. And this is one of the few movies from our class that has a happy ending, that actually the rainbow does shine through, and that the Beatles soar to a new height and show that all you need is love, is one of the things I like about this kind of greatest hits of the Beatles that turned out to be George Martin's fun just composing the music for it, which if George Martin composed the music for it and the Beatles wrote songs for it, just because they didn't do the voices, because the voice parts were needed to go along with the schedule of the animation, and it wasn't even really a scheduling conflict, it was just that the way they animated the film, which is that they would have speaker to mics going into a sort of giant speaker that would record it, and then they could just do it all in kind of as many takes as it took, but all the way through. Wasn't exactly that it wasn't jiving with the Beatles' schedule. They just didn't have time to learn when and go into the mic necessarily, and that they had done cartoons before and would after in short film is not what I'm getting at. It's the type of animation where you've got it on a stick and you're moving it around and then you're matching it to the voice, and that so it ends up being a scheduling difficulty because no one has time to redub the same line 20 times, which is at least how many times you're going to have to shoot it with that kind of line. So that it wasn't a it was a tasking task, and they were very glad that they had voice generators and that they had those voices for them. They were happy for, but that they did sort of collaborate on what the lines would be and then leave them to it is the part of the story that doesn't make it so tragic, that there were actually people dubbing over them, and it wasn't necessarily a sellout move unless you consider they had some time and space, both of them, to kind of work it out. And then they left them with the 20th line repeat thing, which it was ironic because then the Beatles would go on to write Revolution 9, or had already written it in the album for the White Album, and it was sort of all repetitious and sort of this experimental animation of music, that you can see it so vividly now that Yellow Submarine has done it and Hard Day's Night's done it, and the Magical Mystery Tour is really before the White Album and before Yellow Submarine. And the history of where this album goes, I was always confused because of the Yellow Submarine being on the Beatles album, The Revolver, or perhaps even an American release of Rubber Soul, as I've been told to trust the British release. I still like the American release of the Butcher Block cover that still makes up for songs that aren't on the British release. So this could be a way that another Beatlemaniac hazes a Beatlemaniac and says, well, those were all the British releases, except for that's the commercial way it's released. And to an extent, the commercial way it's released is more like a Beatlemania approach we would take, except for maybe the Butcher Block cover, which is Yesterday, Today, and Forever, that had an iron off, that had the chop houses, that was totally commenting on how people that believed in overpopulation in Great Britain were getting rid of their youth, and that the Beatles were getting rid of their youth because everyone thought they were for them to chop up since they were famous. I mean, aren't rich and famous for us to just chop up? Because if we ever met them, we just chop them up. So they're eliminating the chance that they'll ever be met up with by those sort of fans that turn psychotic and wants to take down the person just for being, and the tragic thing is in all countries this has been a problem. Some fan cult will drive onto something, and then they'll be perfectly good for the fandom, but then they'll rise up and sort of be like, well, if I ever see them, I must destroy them and preserve this moment and be connected with them. And really that kind of sensation is the death of rock. To be like such a fan that you got to kill the rock star, that's horrible. But that all comes true with the Beatlemania isn't something we want to think about with Yellow Submarine, because this is towards the end and it's still in their heyday, and that it's in their heyday that it comes to an end means that they totally expanded time, rode the Yellow Submarine like a time machine, put it last in the British release connection, and really this was the first song ever written because they went back in time and made it that way. I wish that was that simple, but that's kind of what happens in the plot, that they bring All You Need Is Love to the actual base of the ocean and play it so that it helps the whole world, not as to make the ocean get psychedelic like it kind of does, but playing All You Need Is Love for the beginning of the ocean is pretty much how you get rid of the Blue Meanies, because the Blue Meanies don't like love, even if they are just imagined things from our negative side of our brain that come out. We see Blue Meanies as a problem for all of us, but whether it's, and I'm going to go with that it's a psychological technique of music is to cure us. Aristotle, he says that music is a healing mechanism, that music heals you, and that music is really the best medicine, and they heal Mother Nature with music is no uncommon theme with the Beatles and other bands of that generation. that believed in persevering with Mother Earth even more so than the Beatles, was that they say that if you healed Mother Earth, it'll heal your depression, it'll heal your sorrow, and the blue meanies will go away just from healing Mother Earth. I'm okay with that because music is very healing, according to Aristotle. So we have a few more things to talk about. That I was saying, it goes back to Lottie Reiniger, and that they look like cutouts of themselves. Well, they definitely aren't rotoscoped this time. But what's different than a cardboard cutout than something that is actually inked over the cardboard and then moved around only in animated movements, so that, again, the process of animation is actually becoming unpredictable as to when it's coming out, being released. And that's another reason they had to use voices, because of the unpredictable release of how long the animation takes. That it just doesn't depend on the drive of the person, but the complicated also of the artistry, that they put those together with the time it takes to take one photo of each of these animated projects at a time. And we got to admit that's going to take 3 years, but that also makes us wonder if they were working on this or not. And that it seems to be unclear in the Beatles anthology as to whether they put this out for just so they'd have an album for kids, which is what they all wanted to do, or if they wanted to subvert the media by having some kind of we need this kind of evolution from man. Or is it like Leonard Maltin would say, a great work of animation? Well, I'm going to go with Leonard Maltin because he seems more grounded, and these other ideals we're getting from the film are great, but that the animation really never flaws, or that it never admits to not being exactly how they wanted it when they made it, is very uncompromisingly Beatles. Because the Beatles never seem to make you aware that they're trying to be the best band, but that they go underwater and have underwater animation that would later become a big fix on Avatar 2. Yeah, Yellow Submarine's great, that all these, even like The Hunt for Red October owes it to Yellow Submarine as to how to shoot a movie underwater when the only precedent is Yellow Submarine. Now that we go back to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the silent version, and we see we're already predicting again. Well, now we're not predicting because we're in the silent era, but that H.G. Wells predicted what a submarine is pretty evident in 20,000 Leagues from the Sea, because they didn't exist when that book came out. And that just shows that all submarines are kind of a prophecy of H.G. Wells. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the movie, reveals that little Nemo, and Nemo being going around in these different early cartoons, like the Dream of the Rarebit Fiend, but that Nemo is Captain Nemo, and that he's fighting this giant squid at one point. It reminds me of Moby Dick in a way. But the submarines, even the idea of sending someone down, even when Queequeg jumps off in Moby Dick and goes swims under the ship and gets the anchor back around to where it needs to be, kind of shows an underwater. Even the great example of that is Mutiny on the Bounty with Charles Laughton, where there's this underwater shot where I think it's Clark Gable is being forced, or it might be Charles Laughton is being forced off the ship, and somebody, it could even be his first mate, but he falls off the mast of the ship, and they show him get run over by the ship, and now you're underwater. So there are all these precedents of being underwater before Hunt for Red October. But what I'm saying is for a submarine POV underwater, which is what I should have said, is kind of unprecedented up to here, except for like War Man footage. But that it's strangely used, that the object of the submarine is now careening through space, and then we're looking at it outside the glass wall. It's kind of a Star Trek imperative too. And I'm not saying that looking out at the helm and the back of this ship kind of being in another cut out of it going along isn't something that all sci-fi and fantasy uses now and the other ones haven't before, but that the precedent with this one is that they're looking through the helm, which is the front of the ship, through a screen, and now they're action commanding, and then you see the side of the ship shooting at something that it needs to, like an underwater fiend. And the point of that is that, like, it takes that Moby Dick traveling, attacking the beast you're looking for, only the happy ending is the redemption of why it's moving the way it is and that they're singing along to it. The point is that Star Trek kind of has that too in its infrastructure, where it has the screen, the action command, going after Moby Dick, kind of. That's what's pressing us along. So that I can't explain it completely mythologically, because in this, a lot of mythologies are subverted, is absolutely true that subverted mythologies are the Beatles, like absolute hope and dream, that they want to create this counterculture is already there. That I don't recommend it for kids. Yes, I do. And I do recommend this for kids. Now, one thing we've got to set straight while this is out here, we have to, is that if I condemn a film, it's not by morals or ethics, because we see that those are meaningless depending on what words go in which direction throughout the definitions of history. But when I say a film is condemned, it only means I don't want kids to watch it, because if kids watched it, they have the wrong idea. But I know some kids that wouldn't even have the wrong idea, so that's why it needs discretion advised. Now, that the ratings board would disagree with me and say kids shouldn't watch this film because it's an R-rated, well, do remember that it was a different time they gave out condemned that would have been like an R rating, except it would have been like, there are still some churches, which we're all the enemy of course, that would say that an R rating shouldn't be gone to see. And so I do apologize for the language of my condemned, because that makes it seem like the Legion of Decency is back. And what I'm saying is it's more like, if the church is telling you not to see it, you probably should if you can, but that it may not be, that it may be a biter for kids. Just remember that your kids are only allowed to see PG movies unless they're smart enough to see an R-rated one. Now, getting into that motion picture syndrome, I do believe that all those ratings systems have come to bust, and it shouldn't have been me to say Clockwork Orange can tail one. Because I know some people that could learn from that movie after all, and learn a few techniques to save someone's life in medicine. And I do viciously command it to wish it could be better on saying nice things about psychologists, and that everybody that wants to say something mean about a psychologist always uses that film. And that's what I didn't like about it, is that it came into today's current context like a movie with good intentions that barged on today's overall entail. And that, like, psychologists always get mad at that film, kind of, because it's portraying them in a bad light, and that's like the wrong person you want to portray in a bad light, because it's like, what do you get against your psychologist? What, you got a problem? It's like, with them, because if you have a problem with them, it might be a psychological problem. And I'm not saying that's totally the way it is with that film. I'm just saying the reason I condemn it is because my psychology friends are totally offended by it, and I was trying to prove why, and it's because they represent psychology in a bad light. And I think that in and of itself, they don't really represent psychology, but that they appear to in some way at all is nasty. But that the film itself is pretty tame in some ways, with the sex and violence that I think there are some really explosive scenes, but I think that with the sex and violence that's polluted all the movies we love now anyway, it's kind of been worn off, except for that the music of Beethoven's played the whole time. So that Beethoven's playing the whole time, now we just think of Beethoven when we think of things like from the movie that were always related back to the movie as film buffs, and never outside the movie, is also how we don't really go into how Yellow Submarine could have really offended someone by that title, thinking it was the type of some, like, I don't know, moon man somewhere that drifted off by the seas of cheese. I don't know what it really means. I never heard of that, but I'm just saying I've heard all the Beatles albums have double entendres, triple entendres. And that's when you can get into vagaries that could be ambiguities that tend to look that no one is pressured to feel bad about anything here, is why I wanted to drill you on the English accent, because we could sound like we're deriding on someone, when in actuality we're trying to be as cool as them, and we look like a bunch of idiots doing it. And really, I only do my British accent when I'm alone, because if I did it over MASTERCLASS too much, then it would be like me making fun of someone when they asked me to have the astuteness not to, and then I'm going, wait, I was making fun of someone. Well, I'll just take their word for it that could be that way. And now I'm like, well, I apologize if that's the way it comes across. It's not that I'm shunning any race, class, or gender to make my own way through this symposium of film or whatever it is I'm doing, because I don't want to discredit someone just because I didn't like a film that helped them. And I said I would only say good things about the film, and really I was trying to condemn it in a good way. But I was thinking about it, and even to me it came across that I don't have the right to say what censorship is, especially when I'm so anti-censorship. But I still don't want to offend a group of people that would be offended if I were to make fun of them. And so it was never in making fun. It was always in good fun. And that's what I like about Yellow Submarine. It's not making fun of, but it's in good fun. That the things they say are really intelligent, and that they had popped their own lines to the people that were generating the movie, and that Yellow Submarine is an A-class movie. And that it has Beatles music timed to the image. Let's not forget that the imagery is tied to the music, and that the music is so into the images that to time that, you also have to be aware of that by listening to the music while you're animating. And that can be hard to get the exact second of time that you're animating the music onto the film that you're recording each individual picture onto, to see which way they move according to match up with the picture. I'm not going to say it again. I mean, I may say it another way in another class, but that's why you come out with like a second a day per animating by your own, if you had no breaks, which you never do, and if you were going a 12-hour shift, which is often what it is, then that's what separates the men from the boys, because like the Disney Studios, which is the one that set that up, is still only going to come out of the studio each day with about a second worth of animation, and that you have to match up a millisecond to a timer on a piece of music is too hard for me. I can talk about it and explain what it is, but actually I can barely match it up when there is music. And that this music you hear now is Parsifal by Richard Wagner, and then it doesn't really match up to the screen. I could then start moving till it matched up. But now you're talking about a fine line between moving a little generated character, in most animation, not all that they do this, to the next generated character is still you generating it, and that you have to trace that out mathematically based on the amount of time the song takes place, plus the shades of and rules of the character itself moving. Oh man, if I was doing that math equation every day, no wonder animators are underpaid and they don't make enough, even though the movie's making tons of money. I'm sure they all felt that. I'm sure they all feel like that they even getting respect isn't enough respect for what they just did to make that movie. You know what? Animators love what they do, so they don't like necessarily have to have their hat full of praise. But if animators had to go through some real listening to these songs, then I don't think they would have made the film if the songs weren't that great. Because if the songs aren't that great, which, don't get me wrong, there are ways to animate not that great songs, as we see with certain directors. And I'm just saying, like, that we have sort of these other types of X-rated cartoons that I'm not into, but like you could animate it there. Not that I'm saying those aren't hard to make either. But that Yellow Submarine takes a hard angle approach from a major studio is saying a lot for their music, because they would have basically said, let's change this, let's change that, if it had gotten real rusty or out of tune with what the characters were doing. So everybody did a magnificent job. And now we're on to my second film criticism review of the day. And remember, writing about film, writing about art is criticism. Is there a difference that you have to be particular about it, that you have to know what you're talking about, that you have to observe the art to experience it and what it means, that observing it in its original historical context is almost impossible? But observing the art is what helps us write about the art, and that is what criticism is. It's our written observances of the art of film is film criticism. And if we can just, that's why we always recommend film journals, because we journal our observances, so written observances of the art of the experience of art is also another way to put it, but the written art of our observed experiences is what film criticism stems from, because it's our written observances of the art about film. Now, where all those, it seems that always where there's written observances about the art of the film that are from experience comes from a movie that a lot of people haven't experienced, and this is a poetic realism beginning called Le Roux. It takes place in 1923. That the French New Wave book says France says in their film history that there are films before and after Le Roux, and that's how they demarcate their beginnings of cinema with the rest of cinema history. That Le Roux could be seen as that it's a train ride movie, that it's one of those big train ride movies. Orson Welles said that when he directed, he thinks of himself as a train engineer, that he's driving a train somewhere important, or that he's playing with the world's biggest train set. And I gotta say, that's probably where he got that from, is Le Roux, because this is a big train set. That there's a big train depot of all these trains being built and coming out, and that's the progress of it, that it kind of has this Erich von Stroheim thing to it before him, that it's by Abel Gance. Abel Gance, even at Telluride, they have a theater named after Abel Gance when they show up, and that's their big outdoor view, and it's one of the biggest screens you can see a silent film on, and they'll have these silent films, and I know foreign silent films will get you anywhere with film buffs, because if you're going to film school someday in the fall and studying film criticism, then write as much as you can about your observances and experiences of film, and find some films that your professors have seen that want you to see it, to set you apart from everyone, and that's the obscure ones. I mean, yes, we can all do reviews of the profound commercialist ones, and we love doing that, and that this is a commercial film in France is not what I'm saying, but you can only write, I like the movie Armageddon, and I think you can write a review about it, but I'm just saying, if you were only writing reviews about that movie, well, if you were much more excellent writer than I know, you could probably write one thing on one topic forever. And so that's not what we're getting at. We're getting at that those reviews would come out all the time doesn't really mean that's a bad thing either. It's just that now we want you to branch out and look at films from across the spectrum. And films from across the spectrum are coming out in Criterion form. And even this, which is a harder to track down, Black Hawk Films, Flicker Alley. I mean, Flicker Alley, that's a surprise to me, because usually these are Image Entertainment, but these are really special, rare, special order discs that are hard to get a hold of, and really do, even on Amazon, take some tricks of knowing what the film is about, and that I recommend you get familiar with film like this, and so that you can score brownie points with your professors when they come out and say, what film did you write your review about? And you'll work either way, but if you know this one, you may score brownie points because they studied legit, where does film language come from, where does film style come from, and this is where they're tracing it back to, is Le Roux, the great classical experiment that didn't fail like all the others. Like Birth of a Nation, Battleship Potemkin, Metropolis, beautiful films, but politically, the industries they were under fell apart because of the political change in their countries. But that Le Roux doesn't fall apart. France doesn't have a sordid history of ruining everyone's lives. I mean, the worst they do is make a slow decision on co-ed schools that is still even notified in Le Roux that there's no place for women in society, but the woman in the film is the best part of the movie. And then it almost becomes like that Erich von Stroheim blind husband's challengeable, let's get to our women somehow by showing them how great they are, and then falling before them, only trying to be as great as them, and proving that these big tabernacles are built for these women actors kind of in this way, doesn't get in the way of this film, whether she's got a race suggestion as poor or rich throughout this, which is nice about a film from France. So sometimes criticism can get critical on things like females, especially, like how they should be treated. Well, if a guy is writing an article about how a woman should be treated, I really would rather read an article by a woman that says how a woman should be treated. I don't remember much of that ever happening in criticism when I'm reading about what someone of another ethnicity is doing. Isn't it always better if that ethnicity is writing about that ethnicity? In LaRue, they never make an issue of it, really, because they're all working too heavy on the stockyard, which is industrialization in France and is dealing with the poorer classes in a way that Chaplin's Modern Times does, but they're not grandstanding. Maybe that's the wrong word, because they are grandstanding that they've got these great machines, but that they're not pulling a Metropolis and saying that the working class is damnated just for being the working class. Whereas Metropolis isn't trying to say that, but the rest of the world is taking it as the working class might as well march themselves up to a Moloch pit. And there we have symbolism. And the Birth of a Nation gets it wrong on a race level, because now we've got a movie about African Americans not by an African American. And that's already a problem in these new beginnings, and that even then, of course, Griffith and his friends Michaud and Robeson were trying to get that off the ground, and when it all got terribly grinded up by the politics of the day, not knowing which side to side which made the filmmakers more vulnerable. And ultimately Potemkin we look at now, and we rarely mention the thing, because now I'm sitting here going, when am I going to do my Tarkovsky review, if ever, now that Russia's kind of screwing over the world. And that's the way I take it, and I can't imagine during Cold War how people would actually be okay with the Russian side of things, because really they were coming to destroy the planet as usual. And I'm not really against the idea of like censorship on a certain group that is going against us in a violently threatening kind of way. I'm not going to show their films, but then again, I'm friends with countries and friends with people, and I have the Iranian friends that are doing excellent work in cinema, way ahead of where I'm at, and that they're friends with me and would include me in their talks. Cool. And so would I stop and talk about Iranian film before Russian because I have prepared to? Yes, but I don't know how I can really relate to a French film if I'm not French, but that I can see the universal qualities of all films, and a film that I find unproblematic even when it comes to class and gender and race, which is nice because it doesn't take a stone's throw of a movie like that to go wrong almost every time, and that LaRue can pull that off is something I think we've got to get. Poetic realism, which sometimes can be leaned on towards this French stereotype of being this really hopeless romantic, which everybody in this film is a hopeless romantic, and that the French can sometimes wax poetic until dark, that everybody waxes poetic until dark, that the industrial age is a time of industry and the making of movies and art, and days of the mechanical reproduction is, although the greatest article to go around, and everybody's got to spread it around, and that's not until after or around the same time of this movie when that article is released, except a little before, maybe even that idea had been written down. But Walter Benjamin's idea came along around the 30s. And so this is after LaRue, but that they have the same idea here, that the art of making the film, even in an industrial, greasy, overwrought, explosive, foggy setting, is totally a perfect way to make the film. And that's what they do. And you look at movies like with trains in them, like The General, or The General has a train use in it. It's a few trains at once. LaRue has as many as 4 trains going at once, but that their General has, by Buster Keaton, as a comedy, and has LaRue mentions in it, is kind of what I was saying about how LaRue doesn't have problems with The General, as we all know, has problems because it sides with the South, and that it's only funny from the point of view that he's got this train on the loose, and that the trains are never on the loose. And LaRue kind of makes me think it's a mild parody. And to be a parody, is that something that makes fun of something, or is it to set up a pastiche, which is a humorless parody? A parody taking the exact scene and copying, it's kind of lowbrow. adding politics to it is kind of roughly more considered edgy, and I think that's where you get Buster Keaton adding politics to it. That again, he's trying to set up these like Americana utopias, failing at it, looking back at it, you're like laughing that he sided with the losing side of the war. And that's what I look at it, less than a race thing. I mean, look, they surrendered, they didn't necessarily lose, but siding with the losing side of the battle is always everybody's biggest complaint about being unpatriotic. And I know that sounds really hilarious, but you're not unpatriotic just because you side with the losing side. That like we won Vietnam, but everybody says we lost because we know we lost our souls over it. Yes, but that I think we won it because we kept communism back for 10 years. Sure, we won it. You know, what was our goal? To keep communism back for 5 years? I mean, if we completed our goal, but then everyone always boos at that war because it was shown on television and it was so horrible on television. But no war has been good anywhere. And the film LaRue is after World War I and doesn't even get as political as I just did, but says that the mechanisms of the train are not to be war machines necessarily, but utility machines. That is to carry goods, to deport labor, bring around like several haulings at a time worth of all the things you can fit on a train is going to save time for the industry. And without it, you can't even begin to ship that many supplies to where you're building a mainframe. You can ship the workers, the supplies, everything to where you were building it and build a city. And that's the key that this film is talking about in industrialism, is they build a city. Not the city was already built like in Metropolis, or that the city needs money like in Gold Rush. But these are all films that spread around LaRue, and that LaRue seems the most human is not actually what most makes it the most seem realist, as according to not just non-professional seeming actors, but a whole world of the train yard and a whole world of all these people that are living in these kind of working class jobs, but they're not working class. They're being paid fortunes of money to build these giant things, actually. Like even the pay looks good in LaRue, you know, that they have time to climb mountains and search for that hopeless romantic at heart love is what this movie is all about. And that LaRue stands for the wheel, and they're talking about the invention of the wheel throughout it. And that there's something I want to discuss, the editing in this. Speaking of all those other films failing at setting up the textbook of how to direct movies, this movie actually secretly contains not only how to build a train in its montages, but it has the most interesting montages that Abel Gance came up with. That in Napoleon, he had a triptych, which is a triple screen, practically a cinerama, where he got 3 cameras side to side at the same distance from each other, building one frame of film, building the one frame that you project the moving frames of film on. And Napoleon had that. LaRue was before Napoleon, and it had this single frame takes. Now, a single frame take, you got to imagine, we just discussed that with Yellow Submarine with the animator, but a single frame take is where you're starting from a regular take, which is just a shot. You start recording the shot onto film, you're recording the shot onto film, and then you cut. Well, if you have a flash single frame take, it could be a subliminal message because you splice it in, like how they were showing on Fight Club, like they spliced in a one splice of this guy flash in the audience, and then they splice back in the film, and nobody ever sees it, but they might have blinked right then and had some kind of subliminal messages transpired to them. But the single frame take is more of a sublime than a subliminal in LaRue, because the subliminal, the in-between frame take comes at almost random, but not so random, which means they mixed it up but then put it back together way of flying between these montages that are actually going to make now the cinema look like it's going faster. So if you take a big chunk that's about 3 seconds long, I know that's really in a montage. Montages can be like limited to 5 seconds usually. Not even that, like longer. Like you can go 7 seconds or really longer and still be a montage. But montage usually considers that there's more than one shot in front of the other at a lesser amount of time than what the other shots of the movie composed are, so that it makes notice of itself. And that's how you would do like a musical montage in the 80s, or like in Dumb and Dumber when Lloyd and Harry go down and get ready for the ball. And I know that's a terrible movie, but it's the best montage because it's like this Larry Moe montage to with these guys like making total jerks of themselves, and then we notice that that's in montage. I'm using that as an example so we can work our way into these LaRue montages, which are more sophisticated, but we're the ones that invented it. And that's where I'm getting at, kind of using the low cult, because we need to take ourselves less seriously, really, as sometimes, because it may not be a great. It's like one of those perfect examples of not to bag on a film. Well, they knew how to use montage in a funny way, and I'm not trying to say that they specifically need more chords of comfort to be defended or anything, but I wouldn't say at least. I'm glad they knew how to make a montage, because that's funny. And saying at least is kind of like putting yourself above someone that may know more than you about how to make a film, and then you kind of get yourself in this, yeah, but the subject matter wasn't that great. So let's forget about we went over that topic of exploitation. I just wanted to make myself clear. Exploitation and B-filmery is not the end of the world. But that LaRue has these really good montages, and it's really neat because you start out with a longer shot, you go to the next shot, it's a little less long, and then you go to the next shot, a little less long. And what the idea is it looks like the film itself is going faster, especially if the montage is positioned at increments or slightly less, or maybe more or less increments. Now you're taking bigger increments off the shot. And the more of an increment you take off the shot, in other words, the smaller the shot is that follows it, whether it was part of the same shot and then set next to it. So if you want it subtly, you just take off a few frames off of each subsequent matching shot. But let's say the shots aren't matching like I'm saying now, then they actually become smaller anyway, because they're smaller shots than the first one, and now you take it even smaller to basically adjudicate the idea that your film itself is going faster, even though you just filmed a bunch of one frame techniques. If you want to see how this works, take like 6 pictures that you've taken and do a flip book at them, and it really gives you that sense of in between the frame takes, or like that it's a still film, but it's not giving you the exact next step of the film in the 24-second period, or the 24 frame series secret in the length of the second, that the shot is length of 5 of those, so there's 24 times 5 amounts of single frames. But now you've only got 4 of them single frames and the rest one shot. It's going to look really skippy that it goes through them, but it might look nifty that you just shifted through some in between frame takes. And that was why I described them now. I'm going to do something very rare. I'm going to give you some time to prepare for next week, and a little less talk from me, because I think I've confused everyone, including myself, on that animation thing. But it's very precise, and that's an equation that isn't exactly the secret of it, but it's one of the many mechanisms, I should say. Sorry, that was negative connotation. Mechanisms that read through an animation that make it a difficult and challenging career. But that's also the very thing that those that find out that's what you do in it want to do it for that, because they want to draw the same picture, barely moving. And that's like cool with me, because then there's more Yellow Submarines that LaRue, and it's in between the frame takes, is already another type of animation, but is montage, and it's experimental, avant-garde film, pure cinema, which is the purity of cinema being alone by itself, cinema for the sake of cinema, or cinema that creates cinema, or cinema that is about cinema, or cinema that does the only things that it knows only cinema can do. Have a good night, everybody. We'll get some pure cinema more at you coming later. And remember that if I condemn it, that might be a little hoity-toity of me. We're not trying to get rascally here just to condemn film. Although Reefer Madness, I do condemn the original. The remake's great, and where would it be without the original? But I do condemn Reefer Madness just to the bottom of the sea. It's a lie. I have met I have met stoners that have gotten their work done and are just fans. So if you guys want to keep on ranting about how Reefer Madness is scientific, that might be your ticket out of my class. Because no, we don't. I'm just kidding. You can love that movie just for how it makes you laugh, but I always thought it was dumb how it started the drug war, and it was such a stupid movie. Anyway, all right, we'll talk to y'all later. We'll have you next class. I'll probably find a way to explain that away too. But anyway, thanks for coming to class, and we'll see you next time. All right, it's been Masterclass.